Welcome to the last installment of the Lenten Forum at St. Paul United Methodist Church. This Lenten Forum concludes tonight and hopefully will bring at least a sense of closure to the issues that we have been discussing together throughout the Lenten season. And we'll raise as many questions perhaps as you may have harvested some deeper understanding of the issues that are facing the United Methodist Church in 2022 and beyond. What I'm presenting tonight is an editing of a third article published by Dr. Ted Campbell, a Methodist historian at Perkins Theological Seminary on the campus of Southern Methodist University. He has a unique mind and way of bringing both history and theology and current politics together in one place, and offers, I think, an astounding call at the end of this particular article. So I've edited it for length and for clarity, but the ideas are his, and I will augment them with my own. Campbell writes, Methodists have been known to practice a bit of politics from time to time. Another United Methodist scholar who is highly regarded, Russell Ritchie, authored a study called the Methodist Conference in America, and in that book he suggests that it was the divisive issues about Methodists practicing human enslavement that led to the transformation of Methodist quarterly meetings and conferences into politically divisive forums focused on more business agendas than on worship and evangelization, which had been the heart of the mission from 1784 until the decade before the Civil War. Sometimes political issues are more about funding the Methodist institutions one represents, or projects that one favors, or agendas that one has. But there are also organized caucus groups that began in American Methodism early in the 20th century with the formation of the Methodist Federation for Social Service, which is now then became the Methodist Federation for Social Action, and now is simply called Social Action, or what was known as MFSA. The MFSA had stood consistently for what some call more progressive social causes within the denominations that succeeded the Methodist Episcopal Church. Identification with caucus groups accelerated strongly, Campbell writes, strongly in the late 1960s, the decade at the end that was pushed by the dramatic power of the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War, around the time of the Union of the United Methodist Church in 1968. African American church leaders strongly supported the dissolution of segregated church structures and feared the consequences, though, of that dissolution. That is, would a white majority church ever elect black bishops, or for that matter, women bishops, or for that matter, gay bishops? In response to these concerns, the African American Methodist leaders organized a group called Black Methodists for Church Renewal, BMCR, a very important group in 1964 that still exists today, and is a voice among dwindling black Methodists in the American experience of Methodism. At about the same time, conservative and predominantly white Methodists, fearing infiltration of what is sometimes labeled liberalism in their churches, were also organizing as a caucus group. In advance of the 1968 Union, conservative Methodists founded the so-called Good News magazine and the associated Good News movement. Now, I do not believe that we can searching for the world, that we can co-relate groups like the precursors to United Methodist Women, or United Methodist Men, or United Methodist Youth as caucus groups. They are recognized by the United Methodist discipline as ministry program areas within the church, and without those groups, we would be the lesser for it. Now, new caucus groups have arisen over the following decades. Hispanic United Methodists organized into a group known by the acronym MARCHA, Methodist Associated for Representatives of the Caucasian Hispanic Americans. And Native Americans have organized the Native American International Caucus of United Methodists. a United Methodist Democrat who questioned denominational spending to radical movements spurred the formation of the Interdenominational Institute on Religion and Democracy, which was quite a powerful figure in the 2019, powerful group and representative group at the 2019 specially called General Conference, which has criticized funding from old-line denominations to non-democratic groups. In 1984, United Methodists, advocating for the inclusion of gay and lesbian people, organized reconciling congregations, now called the Reconciling Ministries Network. And there are churches each week around the connection that have qualified through the proper process of becoming recognized as reconciling local churches. Conservatives responded to this by, in the 1990s, by organizing what was called the Confessing Movement, a parallel to Good News, but with the more robust engagement of larger urban United Methodist congregations, and with an explicit affirmation of traditionalist views on same-sex relationships and marriage. Those who began new caucus groups saw themselves as faithful United Methodists, committed to the good, committed to the whole of the denomination. But caucus structures and activities allowed group members to focus on very particular agendas, often headed in opposite directions from members of other caucus groups, sometimes opposite of the agendas of people rank and file sitting in pews in United Methodist churches, particularly in the United States, making it increasingly difficult to work together as a denomination. Campbell writes, the early 2000s saw the caucuses lining up over the issues of homosexual practice, and a proliferation of new caucus groups emerged with radically divergent views of what it means first to be Christian, and then what it means to be United Methodist. Now he writes about United Methodists and human sexuality in the 1970s and beyond. The issues that have most severely taxed the United Methodist Church are not generic sexuality issues, Campbell writes, or issues about the larger spectrum of LGBTQIA+ people, at least not to date. And this was written after 2019 General Conference. The denomination has not legislated anything about transgender people or asexual people or intersex people, or about, strictly speaking, the variety of gender identifications. Its present legislation relates to those who identify as bisexual or queer only so far as their behaviors can be identified as homosexual. Campbell writes, the specific issues we have been facing are explicitly about, first, quote, the practice of homosexuality, which can be found, referred to in the 2016 Book of Discipline. That is this discipline, which is still in force until the next General Conference meets, hopefully in 2024. The 2016 Discipline, paragraph 161G, page 113, which is a part of the social principles. Second, forbidding the ordination or appointment of ministries of self-avowed and practicing homosexual persons. It's an and, not an or. Self-avowed and practicing homosexual persons. This is referred to in the 2000 Book of Discipline, paragraph 304.3, page 226, and paragraph 2702, subsection 1, at page 788. And thirdly, forbidding clergy blessings and uses of church property for same-sex marriages or same-sex unions, referred to in the 2016 Book of Discipline, at paragraph 341.6 on page 278, and paragraph 2702.1 at page 788. Like other Protestant church traditions, which have gone through this sort of vexing problem of human sexuality, Lutherans, Presbyterians, the Reformed Church, for example. Like other historic Protestant church traditions, Methodists had few explicit resources to deal with these issues, even on the biblical grounds cited in favor of traditional views about homosexual relationships. When Methodist churches in the early 1800s faced the divisive issue of human enslavement and the issue of whether those who practiced the slave trade could even be members of Methodist societies, they had long-standing and explicit resources uniformly expressing opposition to human enslavement, beginning with no less than John Wesley himself. Methodists compromised on these issues early on, but precedents were in place. Methodists facing issues of women's inclusion in ministry could point to John Wesley's explicit inclusion of women as exhorters and preachers, a move so progressive that British Methodists discontinued the practice after Wesley's death, and American Methodists seem never to have implemented it until well into the 19th century. And women were not ordained in our annual conference until 1956. There were no such explicit precedents about gay people, though, or their sexual activities, either in Methodist doctrine or Methodist legislation or the earliest writings. Neither the Articles of Religion, the Confession of Faith, the General Rules, the contents of Methodist rituals or hymnals, nor Methodist disciplinary or social statements before 1972 had explicitly mentioned homosexual relations. Nor did the historic Protestant confessions or the historic creeds from the ancient church have explicit reference to homosexual practice. Folk cultures may have presupposed that homosexual relations amounted to a form of perversion, and gay clergy could be removed from ministry based on criminal charges in civil courts when homosexual relations were defined as criminal behavior in this country. For example, before the 1972 explicit statement in what has become known as the Incompatibility Clause, the Reverend Gene Leggett was removed from ministry, technically located as an elder. That means he did not surrender his credentials, but was removed from appointment in the Southwest Texas Annual Conference on the ground of general but unspecified unacceptability for the practice of ministry. That could have been a cause raised for a pastor who had, for example, been arrested on charges of driving under the influence of alcohol, for example. The lack of explicit reference in doctrinal, moral, and liturgical materials set up different issues as to what should be inferred from our historic doctrinal, liturgical, canonical, and ethical standards. The question is, could we infer from the statements about biblical authority in the Articles of Religion and the Confession of Faith that the Church is bound to St. Paul's explicit condemnations of homosexual sex in, say, Romans 1, 26 through 27, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 10, and 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 to 10. Could we refer that without also inferring that churches were equally bound to St. Paul's command that women should be silent in churches, like 1 Corinthians 14, 33b through 35? Did historic liturgies for marriage explicitly mentioning only the marriage of heterosexual couples, this man and this woman, infer that the church and its clergy are forbidden from blessing same-sex unions or marriages? Powerful folk cultures expressing revulsion to same-sex relationships, Campbell writes, made these inferences seem intuitively obvious to many Methodist people. But the United Methodist Church was not bound to folk cultures, nor to accepting inferences, however intuitive they may have seemed, either from doctrinal or moral or liturgical standards that did not explicitly name issues about same-sex relationships. Campbell writes, one irony is that the statement of our theological task, written in 1972 and included in the 1972 Book of Discipline, the first published discipline of the United Methodist Church, that it was intended to help the church make decisions about just these kinds of issues that had not been explicitly defined in the past. It began by listing hopes and fears that modern life engendered, and it offered the quadrilateral of authority, scripture, tradition, experience, and reason, as a way to think through together such issues. But although the statement may have helped individuals think through these issues, its critical ambiguities, which were referred to in the first part, made it very difficult as an aid to find consensus in the church on these emerging and important issues. So there was no consensus. As the 1970s transitioned into the 1980s, the moral context in the United States shifted significantly by the rising prominence of conservative evangelicals who had chosen to make the issues of abortion and homosexuality central in their renewed engagement in public life. Think of the moral majority and Jerry Falwell, and think about Jerry Falwell Jr. This set up a growing cultural polarization in which conservatives could see more progressive Christians as acquiescing in secular ideas of morality. So now we're painting a picture of one group compared to another. On the other hand, more progressive United Methodists could see their conservative counterparts consenting to a traditionalist ethos that had not been visible in Protestant life in preceding decades. That growing polarization would make the discussion of homosexuality a very sharp set of issues. The United Methodist Church had made its first explicit statement about homosexual practice at that same conference that included our theological task, also made statements when it adopted our theological task, also made statements about homosexual practice. A proposed new statement of social principles had sentences asserting that, quote, homosexuals no less than heterosexuals are persons of sacred worth who need and should have access to the church's ministries. A delegate proposed an addition: though we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. That statement has remained in the United Methodist Church disciplines since 1972, and it has been the center, the vortex of debate in the church ever since. In the 1980s, conservatives added legislation stating that self-avowed and practicing homosexual persons could not be eligible for ordination or ministry appointments. Then in the 1990s, ruled out clergy blessings of same-sex unions or marriages. Each of these restrictions has remained in place and are still a part of the 2016 Book of Discipline. Hence the need for the 2019, which the hope was that there would be some agreement on how we may come to some consensus or how to splinter off in a more gracious or blessed way. Simultaneously, as collaborative structures were waning and funds were being diverted from general church work to local congregations, United Methodist General Conferences every 4 years came to be dominated by issues related to homosexual practice. We weren't talking about ministry or evangelization or a new vision. We were talking about homosexuality. Delegates from the United States and Western Europe seemed to have become more open to ministries of homosexual men and women and marriages of same-sex partners. But at the same time, the United Methodist Church expanded by incorporating Methodist church groups from other countries, like the Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, where prohibitions against same-sex relations prevailed. Their delegates have tended to support the traditionalist position opposed to gay sexual practice. It is true that in the global South, Methodism is growing by leaps and bounds, and there is a conflict between the global North and the global South, because in the global South, not only is there sort of conservative bias against same-sex acts, there's also a bias against women in ministry, which we believe has already been settled in the global North. Unlike the old-line Protestant church families, conservatives in the United Methodist Church have won every vote in the United Methodist Church on issues about gay and lesbian people and their sexual relationships, despite furious politicking on all sides of the issues. United Methodist progressives may have anticipated that the denomination would eventually follow progressives like the Episcopalian, the Lutheran, and Presbyterian groups in authorizing ordination of gay people and allowing same-sex marriages. But although the voting margins have been very, very close and have been growing closer, that still hasn't happened. As I think I told you in 2019, the vote was 53 to 47%. very, very slim. That is certainly not, would not be considered a mandate today. So the voting margins have grown closer, but we have not jumped yet over that hurdle as an entire denomination. In this respect, the United Methodist Church tracks closer to Baptists throughout the world than to other mainline United States denominations. The question has been raised again and again. Can't we find a simple way to agree to disagree? Can we find ways to live with our differences? Can we find ways to live with them regional differences? That may have been possible for previous generations of Methodists, which did do that around the issue of enslavement of human beings. But we do not seem to be able to do that regarding human sexuality. After decades of trends toward local autonomy, the answer seems to be consistently negative. We are an untied church, not a united church. Not just untied in its views of sexuality, but untied in its theological, ethical, polity, and liturgical commitments. Far more untied than it had been in 1972. So Campbell asks, what remains? Well, Methodist denominations have loved celebrating anniversaries of cardinal historical moments throughout their histories. There are 3 memorial stones on the campus of Southern Methodist University where Campbell teaches, conspicuously dated May 24th, 1938, the bicentennial anniversary of John Wesley's Aldersgate Street strangely heartwarming experience, which is a big deal for many Methodists, including me. It was a big deal when American Methodists in 1984 celebrated 200 years since the first American Methodist denominations were organized. And they were organized out of the Philadelphia Conference. The cradle of Methodism is in Philadelphia, in our own conference. Yes, there were Methodist groups also farther south and north, yes, in New York, in Baltimore, for example. But the Christmas conference, though it happened in the Baltimore area, Methodism began in 1729 when George Whitefield came here. So we've celebrated 200 years since the first American Methodist denomination was organized, and in 1991 they celebrated 200 years since John Wesley's death. And then in 2003 and 2007 we celebrated the 300th birthdays of John and Charles Wesley and began the cycle of Methodist centennials anew. But on April 23rd, 2018, when the United Methodist Church reached the 50th anniversary of its founding in 1968, only a very small celebration was in evidence. Even in Dallas, Texas, where the union took place, the Methodists in Dallas simply could not scare up even a skeleton crowd for a commemoration of the founding of the United Methodist Church. The largest gathering was at United Theological Seminary, which had its precursor among the United Brethren Church at Teal Hall on the campus of Albright College in Reading, Pennsylvania. So what remains? If we cannot celebrate the 50th anniversary of the United Methodist Church, what remains for us in the future? Not very much, Campbell writes, of the international and national agencies and caucuses that were at one time the pride of a generation of collaborative Methodists, because high-level problems deserve high-level attention and collaboration. And it's not always a good thing, he writes, to do away with high-level cooperation, but it's certainly not the spirit of the times. We seem not to want to collaborate. Collaboration is seen somehow as collusion. So what remains? Well, more than 6 million people in the United States and more than 5 million or so worldwide still belong to the United Methodist congregations. The United Methodist Church is still the second largest denomination in the United States, even though we keep very fine records and we put out our dirty laundry of how many Methodists we have lost. We still cannot get the Baptists to properly count, the Southern Baptists particularly, to properly count how many Southern Baptists there are, although we know the Southern Baptist Church has been collapsing with even farther more distress, I believe, than the United Methodist Church. So we have 6 million people here, 5 million people, United Methodists around the world, 11 million people, a very strong group around the world. Some groups will be happy to join separating groups. Many will be heartbroken to leave congregations. that have been long-standing. And colleagues in ministry after congregations and annual conferences will complete crucial and divisive votes as to the denominational groups that they will align with. I may see some of my friends going in one direction and another, and some staying with the denomination. What remains? A distinctive way of being Christian. That's always been the joy of being a United Methodist, a very distinctive way of being Christian, combining what is called practical divinity, genuine piety, a way of combining congregational singing, which is where our theology always was, with liturgical and spontaneous patterns of worship, bound up together with collaborative efforts to make the world a better place in anticipation of the return of Christ and his reign on earth. What remains? The presence of our saints and our martyrs in the great communion of saints, that we can name them in the United Methodist Church. These are our saints. Saint Susanna and Samuel Wesley, Saint John and Charles Wesley of Epworth, Saints Mary and John William of Madeley. This is John William Fletcher, who was to be the successor, the hand-picked successor for Wesley, although unfortunately John William Fletcher died before Wesley did. Saint Francis of a long road is Francis Asbury. Saint Philip William Otterbein of Baltimore. Saint Jacob Albright and Martin Beam of Pennsylvania, two important figures in the Eastern Pennsylvania Conference. Saints Harry and John and Henry, the Sons of Thunder, these are Black Methodists, very important. Saints Richard of Absalom of Philadelphia, Saint Phoebe Palmer, the holiness preacher of New York, Saints Francis and Georgia of Evanston, Saint Anna and Julius of Russia, who took Methodism there. I would say for us, the Korean church, for example, it was a Methodist minister who walked onto the Korean peninsula just a footstep ahead of a Presbyterian who was on the same ship. I'm sure that he bumped the Presbyterian to be the first to be there, and there he is. Even this Ted Campbell suggests even Branch Ritchie and Jackie Robinson should be remembered as saints in the church. So there are so many saints that we could remember who come out of Methodism. And we have proclaimed two martyrs in the United Methodist Church, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There are many, many more. With them are our United Methodist and United Brethren and Evangelical Association forebears in the faith. Some of them are written right here on the windows in this. Former Evangelical Association, former EUB, now United Methodist Church, and now United Methodist Church. United Methodist saints and martyrs, what are they doing? They may be weeping, Campbell writes. They may be searching for a great cloud of witnesses to bring around us to help us in our difficult times. So now, after asking what remains, Campbell asks, what can we do? Well, first we can repent and amend the life of the church. He asks, is it too depressing to admit that we need help? Perhaps we can find comfort to pray, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on us sinners. But he suggests that repentance and begging for God's mercy in a draft statement for one's group thinking about a way forward may not be helpful. That was a statement as a part of the combining document that came to the 2019 General Conference, and it was taken out. A prayer for God's mercy was removed from that document that went to the 2019 General Conference. Can we admit that we are in a weakened position? Are we weak? In God we are strong. Do we need mercy? We all need mercy, he says. And he prays, as I pray, for a bit of the share of mercy ultimately for, he says, for each other. Campbell says we need deep, heartfelt devotion to Jesus Christ. He says, I don't have to look much farther than traditional liturgies and the hymns of Charles Wesley to find the wellsprings of Christian devotion. No matter how you find it, cultivating a devotion to Christ is important. And you may have noticed that has been a theme of my preaching throughout Lent with boundaries. Devote yourself to Christ. Put boundaries around yourself. healthy boundaries to protect you from the voices that come from many sides to take us off that narrow path. Campbell says we also need vision. He's an historian, and he knows that vision often comes to those who go away from the place where they have been and can see it from a new perspective. This is what the Augustinian friar named Martin Luther did, traveling to Rome and then returning home with a clearer vision, a clearer sense of call. It's what John Wesley did after returning from America. He was completely broken. Wesley was broken. He wasn't even sure he was a Christian anymore. He came back on a ship, crossing the Atlantic, and I believe hoping that the ship would sink before he reached the shores of England. In a depressed state, he went to a prayer meeting on Aldersgate Street in the city of London, to a Moravian prayer meeting, and there he heard a preacher, Peter Baylor, reading from Luther's commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans about salvation, and he had a strangely warm heart experience. It wasn't his only one, but it was the one that reminded him that he had made the traverse from being an almost Christian to an altogether Christian. John Wesley's return from America helped him find a vision for England. Dr. King, moving from Boston when he came to see the American South, he'd lived there and came north, gave him a vision to go back to the South and to bring about reform among the civil rights movement. He writes, some of us might even gain vision by going away from Methodist communities, at least for a while, and then coming back. Strangely enough, recent polling suggests that there are many Americans who are now giving the United Methodist Church a try. In fact, the numbers are very promising. Polls suggest that people are willing to try worship in a United Methodist Church, are willing to join that church, even knowing that the church is going through such a difficult time. So perhaps, in some sense, we may need to leave in our minds and hearts for a while and then return. That might be an option for some. He writes, we need to continue faithful observance. Most Christians, he writes, did not live to see great revivals of faith, and most of them just kept on repenting and believing and observing the ordinances of God. In the between time, he writes, we could do likewise between now and 2024. We need to keep on saying our prayers, keep on reading the scriptures, keep on holding out our hands to receive the body and blood of Christ, to keep on feeding the poor and clothing the naked and rescuing the perishing, to keep on avoiding evil and doing the good as long as ever we can. He finishes by writing, Christ, have mercy on us. So there we are. That brings an end to this particular presentation. I do not see any good in debating about the scriptural texts, some of which were referred to by Dr. Campbell in his paper, either from the Old Testament or the New Testament. I find debating about those scriptures does not bring light to this issue. We can only unfortunately, in a revisionist understanding of Scripture, can we find any celebration of same-sex acts in the Holy Scriptures. And that is not where my mind is. My mind is where the text is. But my mind is also where the text is in its context. Because without context, we cannot understand truthfully. And certainly, there are many of you who, in a moment of quiet reflection, upon reading the Levitical holiness codes, would wonder if you and your siblings would be comfortable burning your mother if she wore a dress made of two different kinds of fabric. So, what have we let go of that says in the scriptures? Much. What have we embraced? Much. So that means we have opportunities to make some choices. And we have allowed the human sexuality, in particular homosexual people, to be at the center of this debate, and it has caused harm. So I think I want to leave you tonight with a word about where you might be watching from. We have a couple in the booth who are working at a computer. Those of you who are at home are watching YouTube through the internet over a computer. Many of you need computers today in order to do your work. In 1939, a 27-year-old math prodigy, graduate and fellow at Cambridge University through its King's College, was hired to go to Bletchley Radio Factory to find a way to break the Enigma decoder device that had been acquired by the Polish government and brought by stealth to England. The Enigma machine was the machine that was keeping the war machine of the Nazis rolling along and creating great devastation in the war effort among the Allies. It took 2 years, but this young scholar developed and invented, on the basis of a paper that he wrote at Cambridge for his fellowship, for the invention of a digital computation machine. Because it would have taken 20 million years in order to undetect all of the amount of code that was coming through the German government. It would have been impossible. Strictly decoding on paper wouldn't work. A machine that was coding needed a machine to be decoded. He invented that machine. His name was Alan Turing, and he was a homosexual. A homosexual is credited today by no less than Her Majesty the Queen of England, who in 2013 offered him a posthumous pardon for the crime of homosexuality, a crime that caused him to commit suicide when he was 41 years old. Alan Turing's Turing machine is the precursor to what we call today the modern computer. Everyone who is tapping out on a computer is tapping out on an ancestor of a machine created by a homosexual.